And now to kick off the second half of our Canada 360 Economic Summit, we're joined by the Canadian Chamber Business Data Lab Senior Research Director, Marwa Abdou, who will be sharing the Business Data Lab's key insights on Canada's new workplace mobility trends. Really looking forward to this. And Marwa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I really appreciate it. Good afternoon from Ottawa. My name is Marwa Abdou. I'm the Senior Research Director here at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and its analytics data arm, the Business Data Lab. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you all today at my first Canada 360 Summit. And I'm also very much looking forward to presenting to you all on this very timely topic of mobility, and particularly workplace mobility in Canada. Now, before I get started, I wanted to tell you all a little bit of a story. When I was asked to present today on how we can continue seizing opportunities amidst disruptive times, I thought about the recent disruptions that we faced in our lives, and particularly one of the biggest being our work lives. And this story came to mind, this memory that I kept coming back to. A little over 5 years ago, I was fortunate to be traveling in Italy, and I happened to be able to visit the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy. And I saw this painting. It's by an artist named Sandro Botticelli. Now, for those of you who aren't art enthusiasts like myself, Sandro Botticelli, though he's not as well known as his counterparts, like Leonardo da Vinci, who I also happen to adore, he was very well known for really humanizing architecture and their subject matter in their place of work. And I remember looking at this painting and thinking how far we'd come. That as history tends to show us time and time again, whether it's through art and literature, or even recent events, that it's not usually the way it seems. And that sometimes progress can be perhaps looking backwards, but it also can allow us to reflect a little bit more acutely on how art and literature can really provide a lens to what is going on in our lives and how we can kind of move forward from it. Sandro Botticelli had two paintings that were titled St. Augustine in his study, and both of which were completed in 1494. Now, while we're a ways away from there, for centuries, we've associated going to work or being at work with the office. And here at the Business Data Lab, we've been studying recovery and post-pandemic adjustments at various levels. And one of the lenses that we really wanted to look through is mobility, because of how important it is for millions of Canadians and for people around the world. And before I kind of dig into the findings, I want to kind of go back to our thought process in kind of looking at mobility. Because one of the questions that I think we were all asking throughout the pandemic is, are we there yet? Or some variation of it? Are we back to normal? And before I give you the answer to that question, I want to start by saying that if you don't remember anything from this presentation, or if you can't follow through, I want you to keep these three main headlines in mind. First and foremost, the answer to that question is no, we're not there yet. And the second thing I want you to keep in mind is that it's true. Normal is going through a massive change, but it's not all bad news. And lastly, the third thing that I want you to keep in mind is that even though this change is happening and it's big, it's not uniform. The who, the what, and the where matters quite a fair bit. So when we look at workplace mobility, and what we define as workplace mobility is really the proportion of the workers going to the office or place of work as compared to pre-pandemic. So mobility data here can allow us to understand footfall and foot traffic in a particular neighborhood or a point of interest. It can tell us who's going to those places, how long they're staying, where are they coming from, and where they're going afterwards. For us, when we look at workplace mobility, and particularly when we compare it to pre-pandemic, which we define as January 2020, we realize that when we look at mobility, we have, for a specific area, that when we see a negative mobility percentage or proportion as compared to pre-pandemic, it means that there's reduced footfall or traffic in that area. And then when it goes up or it's above zero or it's a positive workforce mobility, it means that there is growth or boom or greater footfall or action going on in that particular geography. So here's the punchline. Canada's pre-pandemic mobility patterns look way different than what they do today as of December 2022. Looking back at 2020 and comparing to where we are now, we can see that obviously we've come a long way. If you start at April 20, which was perhaps the highest point of pandemic restrictions and countermeasures in place, and perhaps the lowest point of immobility that Canada has experienced since then, it can be sensible why we thought that perhaps it was just a matter of time, that as restrictions lifted, mobility returned or picked up. As restrictions came back into place or were tightened, that mobility dropped. And it seemed like we were heading in the right direction throughout the pandemic. But then restrictions started being lifted a little over a year ago, or almost a year ago. And since then, mobility hasn't returned. In fact, as of December 2022, we know that Canada's workplace mobility is at 88% compared to pre-pandemic, meaning that only 88% of Canadians are reportedly back at work, whereas 12% are not back yet. So what's going on? The really cool thing about this data set is that we're not only looking at the picture at the national, provincial, or territorial level, we're also looking at it at the CMA level. We're looking at it at the downtown level. The data is quite rich. It covers 153 census metropolitan areas, as well as 55 downtown cores. Now, if we actually aggregate by the provincial capitals, we see that general patterns still follow, that we're still quite slow to return to work. But the picture looks slightly better, perhaps, at the CMA level than it does for downtowns. That being said, when we aggregate it by size and population, the picture is far more dramatic, telling us that Canada is only 80% recovered at the CMA level of the largest cities in Canada. So when you throw in cities like Hamilton and Kitchener and Ottawa and Gatineau, the numbers become quite dramatic. And particularly what is notable is the extreme difference between the mobility in those cities in their downtown cores as compared to the CMA level. This is an unpacked version of the previous slide, This is an unpacked version of the previous slide that includes maybe perhaps some of the downtown cores that we're talking about. And what we're seeing is previously booming, vibrant downtown cores like Calgary, like Vancouver, like Toronto, are still at only 40 to 50% of their mobility rates as compared to pre-pandemic. And so it caused us to kind of sit back and think, well, what's happening in those cities? And why is foot traffic not picking up despite these restrictions being lifted? And what we realized is that mobility is more than just COVID restrictions. It was more than just the timing of the restrictions, the length, and the intensity of those restrictions. What it is about and what it can be impacted by is the who. So the attributes of who is going to work in those cities. Are they married or not? Do they have children? Their income level, their education, the what matters. So what was happening in those cities and how they were structured or what their economy looks like impacted mobility quite a fair bit. So when we're talking about what are the commute modes that are available for the workplace in that area or the workforce in that area, what are the industries that shape these economies at the local level? And lastly, the where. And I'm not just talking about whether they're in Atlantic Canada or Central Canada. I'm talking about the geography level. So whether we're talking about a downtown or a CMA, the pattern's vastly differed. But that was also really important for us to kind of dig into and understand, because the implications of those vastly vary, whether you're talking about how a downtown can be impacted by reduction in footfall traffic versus that of a city. So kind of before I dig into the findings, I wanted to kind of get a little bit more specific and look at cities, specific cities, and provide you all with some examples that can drive some of these messages home. The role of education was quite potent. What we found is that geographies that have a higher share of workers with university degrees, be it bachelor's or above bachelor's, were actually slower to recover than those who had perhaps lower share of university degrees. And so when we look at two cities, particularly Calgary and Edmonton, this is quite an interesting case study. Calgary is home to many large energy and finance companies, whereas Edmonton's economy is shaped by retail, manufacturing, and agriculture. At the CMA level, almost 3/4 of Calgary's workforce is back at work, compared to only a little over 1/3 in its downtown core. In Edmonton, it's doing much better, marginally at both levels, with a little bit more than 80% and almost half of the workforce back at the downtown level, a little bit over 80% at the CMA level, and a little bit almost half at the downtown level, that is. So let's look at the structure of, or the educational background of Calgary's versus Edmonton's workforce. What we see is at the CMA level and at the downtown level, there's a higher proportion of workers with university degrees in Calgary at both the CMA level as well as downtown than Edmonton. The next variable that we wanted to take a look at was family structure. Abbotsford Mission in British Columbia versus Barrie. Now, although they are provinces apart, they actually have a little bit more in common than I initially thought. Both are mid-sized cities. Both are, within commuting distance to these bigger hubs like Vancouver and Toronto. And both are actually doing great right now. So, congratulations to people in Abbotsford and Barrie. Your downtowns are quite booming right now. But what is actually interesting about the data is that Barrie's downtown is doing significantly well. And it's hard to miss that. So what's happening in those geographies that's really helping them recover a little bit faster? Well, if we dig into the data, we find that there's a statistically significant role, as I mentioned, that family structure is playing. So at the CMN level, we see that both cities have a much higher proportion of married workforce than not. But that's not entirely shocking because, if you're married, you tend to want to perhaps not live downtown and perhaps stay closer to the suburbs or move further apart to get, better locale or because you want to expand your family or whatever reasons that may be. But what is interesting is looking at the compositions downtown. While what's happening in Abbotsford is not entirely shocking, where you're seeing more folks who are not married as compared to married. But in Barrie, there is exactly an even split between those who are married versus those who are not. Let's look at, dependents. So how much of that workforce, be it at the CMA level or at the downtown core, how much of that workforce actually has dependents, children? So in Barrie, we're seeing that there's actually a much higher proportion, almost 3/4 or more of Barrie's workforce downtown is without kids, whereas that differential is much smaller for people in Abbotsford downtown. The next variable that I wanted to look at is commute modes. Sorry, we're having some technical difficulties, but fear not. With commute modes, it's actually quite interesting and it's quite a curious case study. So I wanted to take a look at Toronto and Ottawa, where I'm, calling in from, and in Ottawa and Toronto, we're seeing that there is a much higher proportion of of the workforce that is using public transit downtown Toronto, as well as at the CMA level, as compared to Ottawa. Lastly, we wanted to take a look at industry. And we know that from our recent CSBC survey that, perhaps people who are working in certain secondary and tertiary industries are more leaning towards actually being on-site versus those who perhaps are in more tertiary or in primary and secondary sectors or industries are more leaning towards being on site. Whereas in tertiary industries such as information, culture, professional services, and finance, you're seeing more of a variance. And so it's sensible when we look at the data that people in Saskatchewan are, showing a much better pickup in terms of mobility than perhaps people in Ontario. So to close, I want to leave you with 3 takeaways. Hybrid is here to stay. And while the workforce disruptions of COVID have perhaps, overstayed their welcome, that we better get comfortable because something big is happening. The second takeaway I want to leave you with is that central central creative districts are spreading out. So you're not going to just see these central hubs take place in Toronto or Ottawa. You're also going to see them in cities like Kingston and Barrie. The last thing I want to leave you with is that doing business is evolving to keep up with these trends. And downtowns have evolved for as long as time can be, and they'll continue to be. So we better brace ourselves for a different way of doing business. And I want to invite you all on that note to keep up with the trends on our online dashboard that you can find on our chamber website. And I want to thank you all for listening in and tuning in today. And I'm happily going to share this presentation on my LinkedIn page. So please feel free to connect and reach out if you have any questions. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. And I look forward to seeing you all here in person next year. See you. Bye-bye.